Darren, there were a lot of bad things that happened this year related to not having enough moisture. We had drought, horrible crops, and now this could cause a problem going into next year because we're worried about herbicide carryover.
You know, it's not so bad when you can take your lumps this year. You say, you know what, it was a bad year, boom,
Right.
We harvest, it's a short crop, we're done. Well, no, you're not. There are some products that you may have applied for weed control on your farm that could still be hanging around out there that could impact your decisions for next year. What we're talking about here is herbicide carryover.
What we want to focus on today is what are the factors that you need to consider on your farm for if you're going to have herbicide carryover or if you're not. And the number one factor is how much soil residual does the product I'm using actually have? Does the product that you used actually hurt the next crop you're going to plant? So for example, let's say you used Outlook or Harness or Surpass in corn. Is that really going to carry over long enough to hurt your soybeans next year? And even if it did, is it actually going to hurt the soybeans? No and no. So I wouldn't even worry about those products. They're kind of off the table, okay? But there are a number of other products. Let's focus on the soil factors that we really want to look at when it comes to carryover.
Well, let's look at soil pH first. That's the biggest thing when we're looking at soil tests just for crop production, but it's also huge in terms of breaking down herbicides. We've got some herbicides that have big time problems when we have high pH, and we have other herbicides that have big problems with low pH. So like for example, Pursuit is one. A lot of guys were using Optil, Extreme, Authority Assist, or even just Pursuit or Raptor straight. I mean, there are a lot of combinations that have those products in them. If you have low pH soils, if you're down in the 5s in certain parts of your field, number one, you better get liming. You should be worried more about getting lime on than just about anything else in those fields. But number two, you should be very concerned about herbicide carryover, especially if you use Pursuit or one of those relatives.
Okay, on the high side of things, that's where we see more Atrazine carryover. And quite honestly, there are a lot of other products that will carry over in high pHs. And what we're talking about here is the ideal soil pH is 6.8 for most crops. Outside that range, you don't have a big problem if you're a half point one side or the other. So 6.3 to 7.3, not a big deal in terms of crop production. You can still get good yield in terms of nutrient availability, and in terms of herbicide carryover, you generally don't have as much problem. So anything below 6.3 or anything above 7.3, that's where you start seeing more carryover problems, and we want to be concerned about that. You got to take a look at that hard, and it might be in most of your field there's no issue, but then in spots you've got an 8.5 pH. Well, in those spots you're probably going to have some herbicide carryover if you have Atrazine or Classic or a number of other products. So just make sure that you're talking to your agronomist, looking on the ag chem labels, and checking to find out if you're going to have issues with the herbicide you used.
And with soil pH, that also impacts all that soil life out there, all little bacteria and fungi and other things that are living in your soil that help actually break down herbicides.
So going into the fall, other things that you might want to consider is if your herbicide's still laying on top of the ground, does sunlight break that particular herbicide down? Another thing is vapor pressure. So let's say, for example, last spring you put out Treflan and you didn't work it in. Well, Treflan has ridiculously high vapor pressure. You probably lost most of your Treflan right then anyway. So herbicide carryover isn't as much of a concern as opposed to if you immediately tilled it in.
Well, the other thing I look at, Brian, is really the timing of when you sprayed your product. Did you spray it out there when there were lots of weeds that you sprayed it right on the foliage? That's certainly going to reduce the amount of carryover you're going to have. Or did you spray it on bare dirt and then you really didn't get weed growth or moisture to get things into plants? You know, you've got a lot more risk if most of your herbicide landed on the bare soil and there weren't weeds out there versus, hey, I had heavy weed pressure, I couldn't even see my crop and I sprayed it out there. Well, chances are you're not going to have much carryover in those situations.
All right, the main thing we want to stress to you here to wrap this up is with herbicide carryover, you need to look at the ag chem label, the product you used, and it will say right on there, what is the rotational restriction? In other words, how many months until you can plant the crop that you want to plant. In a drought year though, what we want you to do is extend that time. It's something that I just don't want to take a chance on. I'm willing to take a chance on a herbicide that's somewhat questionable in terms of weed control. I miss a few weeds, so what? But if I hurt my next crop, I just suffered from poor income this year. I don't want to have poor income again next year. So be very careful, and in some cases you might have to plant the same crop you planted this year, plant it again next year if you're worried about herbicide carryover.
But the big question, Brian, is going to be, what does it take to kill our weed of the week? Do we have to worry about carryover with those products? We'll show you which ones work best coming up next.